Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon for everyone joining us from around the world. Welcome to our OECD webinar, Why Should We Care? Empathy in Education Policy, Practice, and Assessment. And I see people joining us already in the chat with greetings from all over the world. Welcome. So today we're going to talk about empathy. Empathy is a word that we almost all use and talk about quite a lot these days. Parents might say that they want their children to be kind and empathetic when they grow up. Many of our world religions encourage empathy for people who are struggling. And in today's world of political polarization and increased migration, we may hear about the need for empathy for people from different cultural and political backgrounds. But what is empathy exactly? Does it really matter? And if it does, how do we teach it? And how can governments help create space for it through good policies and assessment so that we can track how we're doing and continue to improve? And today, we will discuss exactly these questions with 4 panelists from around the world, and I will introduce them in a moment. And first, I will start with myself because I will be moderating the discussion for you today. My name is Katarina Gresswright, and I am an analyst with the OECD's Survey on Social and Emotional Skills, or SSES. And the reason we're doing this webinar today is because SSES is the world's largest survey of social emotional skills in school-age children aged 15 and 10. And we've been measuring empathy together with other skills in over 30 education systems across the world since 2019. And you can read about empathy in our latest reports with our 2023 data that we will post in the chat shortly. And we're here today because empathy is a big focus, not just of our past rounds, but especially our current round. And we're really excited for the results that we will publish next year in 2027. And so today we're doing this webinar inspired by that work and to share that journey with you as we dig in today and try to understand empathy more, what it is, why it matters, and how we can support it in our education systems. And without further ado, let me introduce our distinguished speakers who will be discussing all these questions with us today. We start with Ms. Isabel Segovia, the Secretary of Education of Bogota, Colombia. We're joined by Dr. Rory Devine, Professor of Education and Psychology at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom, and also a consulting expert for the OECD's Survey on Social and Emotional Skills. We have Dr. Cristina Salmivali, Professor of Psychology and Deputy Head of the Invest Research Center at the University of Turku, and also Director of the Kiva Anti-Bullying Program in Finland. And finally, Mr. Subbu Parameswaran, co-founder and CEO of the Learning Curve Life Skills Foundation in India. So really a great panel from all corners of the globe. And so to start off today, I think it's good to start with this core question, which is, what is empathy? So we'll start with you, Rory. You've been studying empathy for a long time, why it matters, how to measure it. So how would you define empathy? Why does it matter? Help us understand the basics.
Thanks. I mean, as you alluded to in your introduction, there's a kind of everyday usage of the word empathy, but as scientists and researchers, we have kind of landed on a set of features that we would call empathy and that we focus on in our work. So often we can think about empathy in kind of as comprised of 3 things, maybe. The first is your ability to understand what someone else is thinking or feeling. So literally just getting what someone else might have on their mind. We also then think of empathy in terms of our response to that. So whether or not it resonates with us in some way. So there's a kind of feeling part of it. So there's a kind of I get you part of it and I feel you part of it. And then the third element is to do with our actions or our behaviors. So we can often think about whether or not the sharing of a feeling with someone else or the sharing of a mental state with someone else motivates us to action in some way. So we kind of think of it in those 3 terms, really. And where it fits in more broadly is that we think of empathy as a kind of cornerstone skill. So I'm a developmental psychologist by background, and what we're trying to do is to think about this as a kind of basic underlying skill that kind of connects to other real world skills in terms of building and maintaining relationships with other people.
Wonderful. And so why does empathy matter? Like, has your work touched a bit upon, like, you said it's a cornerstone or a sort of foundational skill. Why is that?
Well, there's actually a lot of evidence now emerging that when children do well on measures of empathy, and there are ways that we can measure empathy that I'll talk about later, when children do well on these measures, we see that performance on empathy tasks and questionnaires and measures seems to map onto real world things. So, for example, in some of our studies, we've shown that children who are empathetic tend to be rated by their teachers, for example, as being more cooperative, more engaged with others, better at forming peer relationships. From a child's eye view as well, we see that children who are more empathetic tend to be liked more by their peers, for example. They tend to report being less lonely than other people. And then beyond the kind of social domain, there's also even emerging evidence that some of the skills of empathy are actually linked to academic achievement in a quite direct way. So, for example, reading comprehension, so understanding the kind of higher level meaning of a text, for example, like what an author is intending to convey in their text, is also somewhat linked to empathy as well.
Okay, that's already like a range of potential outcomes that we've also starting to look into in our work here at the OECD. And actually, that provides a lovely segue to our next speaker. So, Dr. Christina Salmivali, your work at the Kiva Anti-Bullying Program has been implemented in several countries to combat bullying in schools. Tell us a little bit about what is the link between empathy and bullying, and how can education systems use empathy to foster more inclusive education environments?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I've studied bullying for decades, and it's very clear the connection between empathy and bullying behavior. I mean, both affective and cognitive empathy that Rory was referring to are negatively associated with bullying behavior, which is, it's clear, but it's hardly surprising. So those kids who understand how others feel and who also tend to feel these same emotions are less likely to bully others. And because it's a key variable when we think about bullying, also in Kiva anti-bullying program, we have included many ways in which we try to enhance empathy towards fellow students. In the prevention of bullying, like in the student lessons in Kiva, we have exercises and actions and discussions where we try to promote empathy. And actually, some years ago, we published a study together with Claire Garandeau where we looked at the effects of the program on children's empathy, and we indeed found significant changes in their affective empathy, in their ability to feel how someone who is bullied, for instance, is feeling. Another way, not only in preventing bullying, but when we are trying to stop bullying, giving guidelines to teachers on how to do that, we also have a procedure where we are trying to raise empathy in students, try to prompt them to make them think about from the other person's perspective. How does it feel if these kind of things are happening to you on a daily basis or on a weekly basis when you go to school? And actually, we have found that if you just condemn the bullying behavior and say that this is not okay and you have to stop bullying, this can work, but it's more likely to work if you also add this empathy raising component where you try to make students think how the bullied student feels. And one interesting thing maybe I would like to add that some surprising findings also, I mean, for instance, those children who report low empathy, in the questionnaire, they have said that they don't really get so well what others are thinking or feeling. They are still responsive to this empathy enhancing intervention. And to me, this tells that it's not only a skill that we are talking about, but it's really a lot about motivation to put yourself in other person's shoes. So we all have empathy skills to some extent, and it's really, we need to be prompted maybe and encouraged to put them to use and think about things from the other people's perspective.
So it's so interesting what you said, that motivation and the kind of, it's not just can you understand what someone else is thinking, but are you motivated to do that and to really put yourself in someone else's shoes? In a beyond sort of, or in addition to bullying, have you seen how education systems can use empathy to sort of foster inclusive education environments generally?
Well, I think, as Rory was saying already, empathy is such an important construct that it matters for so many things that for sure, if we can enhance empathy in our education system, that will lead to so many different benefits, reducing loneliness, creating healthy relationships, well-being at school, well-being in the society in the long run.
Okay, thank you. And this idea of society leads us well to the next question, which is for Secretary Segovia. So we know that the Secretariat of Bogota in Colombia has focused a lot on social and emotional skills in its schools in recent years, and empathy is one of the skills that you have targeted. So how has the Secretariat tried to address social emotional learning and especially empathy at the system level? And why did you try to do that? What lessons have you learned?
Okay, hello everyone. Good morning from this part of the world. My fellow speakers, Katarina, thank you for inviting me and to be able to share the experience that Bogota has had so far. Bogota has approached a social and emotional learning process, including empathy, of course, as a core dimension of educational quality and student well-being. But it's very good to stress this because you have to link the well-being of students to the quality of education. If you're not in a mindset to be able to learn, it doesn't matter how good your programs in mathematics and language or everything. You will never make children learn without they being safe and adjusted and well-being in schools. So when we decided to draft and design this program, we linked it immediately to our quality education program. Not just the well-being part, but you go to school to learn, and to learn you have to have the conditions to be able to learn. And what happened in 2024, when we arrived a couple of years ago at the beginning of the year, we really found a significant deterioration in school climate and student well-being. And it was evidenced by different reports that we have. We actually have a school alert system, which is very well developed in Bogota, especially. We also had the school climate index that has been applying for several years before we arrived. And we also implemented the OECD SSES study, which gave us a lot of information about how deteriorated the school climate in schools in general were. Of course, the pandemic had a lot to do with that. The information we had in 2019 and the information we got in 2023 was completely different. So I have to confess, by the way, that I've been in the education system for a very long time. I left the public sector for around 10 years, and something that really changed in school conditions was really the emotional learning and everything that had to do with school climate. That wasn't something when I worked before in the ministry, in the Minister of Education in Colombia, that really worried us. So things changed drastically. So what did we did? We responded systematically integrating social emotional education into schools through a program that is called Escuelas with Emociones, which means Schools with Emotions program, working simultaneously with the school leaders, teachers, counselors, families, students, and developing a social emotional learning framework that defines exactly what you expect in each stage for the development of the students, from early childhood to adolescence, of course. The other thing we did, which is very important and which is being implemented this year, but we've been working the past 2 years too, is that we named a lot of psychosocial counselors, which are mainly psychologists and social workers in general. We have 1,750. We have them in every school, in every public school in Bogota. And we also design parameters to be able to distribute the additional ones that we have, because we have 412 schools, so you can imagine. So we also have schools that, because of the amount of children, we have almost 10 psychologists in them. But what we did additionally is with all the information that we had, that is very important to use information, as you know, I don't have to tell the OECD members how important that is. And what we did is we designed the parameters so that we can actually put more psychologists and counselors in places where we had more deteriorated the school climate. So we are actually implemented that this year. We already assigned the counselors to the different schools. So we are expecting to enhance a lot the program that we actually designed with all this support that we have there. Girls and boys in Bogota are not alone. We have a stronger team of counselors who support them by listening, getting them to know them, guiding them, supporting the families, and help them understand why being well has a lot to do with enjoying and learning, which is very important. And we are also working on something that we think is very important too, and that we found through the implementation of the program, that is, we really need to teach and to enhance in our teachers and families all these skills. It's very difficult to transmit empathy or self-regulation or conflict resolution or assertive communication if actually the grown-ups around the kids don't have it. So what we did additionally was add to this program, to the Escuela with Emociones program. What we did was basically link especially the leadership in schools to be able to enhance these skills, to be able not to be just role models, but to transmit them and enhance them as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I mean, what I'm hearing is this enormous effort that's, monitoring and curriculum design and allocating counselors also based on need, as well as you said, involving families and staff and getting their social and emotional skills, including empathy, sort of improve. And we'll come back to that. And segue into the next one, which next question for Subu, because you work very directly with teachers and practitioners. And so your organization, Learning Curve, as we understand, takes very much a whole school and whole child approach to learning, and empathy is part of your social emotional learning program. So why are you taking that approach of the holistic whole child approach? Why is that important? And how can it help us nurture skills like empathy more effectively?
That's a good question, and I'll attempt to respond this more as a practitioner than as a researcher in that sense. I think the way based on what we've learned in the last sort of 10 years or so, we know that empathy can be taught, but it can't be really taught in isolation. Because empathy is really not just something that is cognitive. It's relational in nature, it's ethical in nature, it's cultural in nature, right? And there are multiple dimensions to that. So where do children really learn empathy from? I think firstly, they learn from how school feels for them. Children who are anxious in school, children who are afraid in school, for whatever reason, right? Whether they'll get punished or whether they'll get labeled, don't experience empathy from an adult, and therefore then that affects their ability to learn. And I saw in the chat, one of the participants said that if children don't experience empathy, then how can they learn it? And that's one of the very fundamental constructs of it. Second is about relationships. What are the relationships that actually exist between the teacher and the student? What are the relationships? How are these relationships between peers? How are their voices heard? If student voices are not heard in classrooms, in schools, then that's another thing, right? And how do they learn empathy from that? And I think one of the more understated ones, but I think very fundamental, is that children learn empathy from adult behaviors. They learn it from us, they learn it from their teachers, or they don't learn it, as the case may be, right? So what we realize is that there are multiple components of this. One around emotional safety, one around perspective taking, and the ability to have some agency around it, right? How do I act with empathy, right? And these are those components. So, and that's really why we sort of look at a whole school. So empathy for us is not a standalone construct. It is embedded within almost every component of what we do. So empathy is driven by school climate, for example. Empathy is driven by what are the school policies? How are those interactions between teachers and students? How is inclusion practiced in the school, right? And that's a very, very important part. So the way we see it and the way we've practiced it, and we continue to learn from that, of course, is that empathy is more than a programmatic element or just a program. I think it's part of, and it needs to be embedded within the culture of the school and the larger education system. So that's how I would respond to that question, Kat.
You raised so many points too, that I think are echoed certainly by Christina and by Isabel, about the idea of having to see empathy, see it modeled, that they learn it from adults, and that kind of it both is influenced by and also affects lots of things, like beyond just the narrow skill itself. And actually that makes me think of, I'll jump now into, I think, some of the questions that we have for you guys as a group, and some followed by some questions from our audience. I already see lots of them popping up, questions from Kenya, Denmark, Colombia, Mauritius. So actually, I'm going to start with teacher training, because this has come up. A couple of you have mentioned, you mentioned it, Subbu, Isabel, you mentioned it. Several of our attendees, when they submitted questions, when they registered, asked about teacher training. How do we better train teachers to teach empathy? Do we teach them the neuroscience of empathy and like the particulars? How do we train teachers when they're working in really like academic and results-driven systems where they maybe don't have a lot of incentive or encouragement to focus on these sorts of skills? So what's needed in teacher training in your view, and where should we start? Christina, go ahead.
Yes, thanks. I don't think that teachers need to know the neuroscience of empathy in order to teach empathy. I think that maybe teachers need to understand, and this is also a response to some other questions that I saw in the chat. I need the teachers should be aware that empathy is something that is in us as human beings. We were born with empathy, small babies, and there is another baby around who is crying. These emotions, there is this contagion of emotions that shows that even small babies and also toddlers, when they see someone in trouble or dropping something, they are all worried and they are trying to help. So it's something that's very natural for us, and therefore we just need to remember to feed it in different situations, to provide possibilities to use it, to use this skill, to use this ability to feel what others are feeling and understand what others are thinking.
Rory, go ahead.
Yeah, I just would build on that point. I think I agree that you probably don't need to know the science of empathy necessarily. I think, but there's a few core messages. I think, being aware that empathy is multifaceted, like we've been talking about, being aware that it's something that can change, right? So it's not something that's fixed. I also have this real bugbear about people calling empathy and similar things soft skills, as if they're kind of just trivial things that aren't important or difficult to master, and recognizing that there should be space for nurturing empathy, for supporting it. And you had a question about, very target-driven educational systems. And this is a question I've been asked before. And I think it doesn't have to be standalone lessons in empathy, right? There's opportunities to support empathy in everyday interactions, so even things like in reading fiction, for example, with children, recognizing, oh, what do you think about the story? Or what does your neighbor think about the story? Like highlighting perspective differences is a way of fostering empathy on a very, very basic level, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be a standalone separate thing all the time.
Thank you. In fact, okay. This idea of integration, Isabel, and then Subbu.
Yeah, sorry. Um, just a very short thing. I think, I already mentioned, and everybody has mentioned that empathy is something that you have. You just have to, to use it, basically. And training teachers and adults in general, our own children, to use it is really just to do the same thing that they will do with children, because there's not this line of training specifically just to show them how to be empathetic, and they will be empathetic and they will show it to the kids as well. But I will also want to make this a little bit more structure, meaning the effort that Bogota has made in constructing the social and emotional learning framework helps teachers a lot understanding what level of the social emotional skills they need to address in the different ages. And I think having a framework is very helpful for the teacher training and for the guidance of teachers in schools.
Thank you for that, Isabel. Subu, go ahead.
Um, I think we need to look at teacher training a little bit differently, right? Training not from the lens of a teacher being able to now deliver a certain set of curriculum or lessons and all of that, right? So when we work with teachers, we look at it from a developmental standpoint and the teacher's own developmental standpoint. So how do the teachers actually feel supported? How do the teachers themselves feel safe in a classroom, for example? How do we enhance the teacher's own emotional awareness of themselves? And when they're able to do that, there is no need for a set of lesson plans. I think they will find ways to sort of translate that back. They will find ways to handle conflict better. They will find ways to respond better and manage their own pressure without transferring that to the students, right? I think that's one sort of lens that we've been taking towards teachers, and that's worked. That's worked, and that will continue to work, I think. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So I'm hearing this interesting kind of a spectrum almost, that on the one hand is having faith, and we know empathy, it's a really natural thing, and we don't need to sort of in some ways overcomplicate it. At the same time, teachers need structure, what to look for at certain ages. They need support with developing their own social emotional awareness, and these things sort of come together. And thinking about that, a lot of you have worked with teachers in different ways. What are some lessons you've learned when it comes to working with teachers and training them and trying to maybe build their skill set? What are some things that you've learned about what's worked really well? What are some things that have maybe not worked so well as you've done that? I think go with any of you guys who wants to start with. Subu, Christina, maybe, or even Isabel. Yeah. Isabel, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead. Well, again, I think in the social emotional skills, and being empathy is such an important one. You also have to put a little bit of structure around it, because if not, it becomes, like Rory said, a little bit like a soft skill somehow that is not important. It just comes on. And I think almost in every issue, when you do that with mathematics, you're very serious about it. So, you have to be very serious about social, emotional skills in general. And then empathy, of course, is almost the base of them. And I think you need to have a framework, not just the framework that I mentioned before, but you have to have an institutional alignment. You have to have a curricular integration that is part of what you want to accomplish. In this case, you really, really need engagement from all the community, especially families. Because if you start doing a strong work in school, but there's a non-alignment with the families and the community around, it's very difficult to maintain a social emotional skills framework if you don't have that. And you also have to create intentional spaces where you can actually, children can actually live what empathy means and what social emotional skills mean. So I think it's something that you shouldn't, my summary of this, you shouldn't take this as something that is light, because is there, and if you're a good person, you're probably going to be able to teach it or to enhance it in a way. I think you really need to structure it so that it will happen.
Thank you so much for that. Subu or Christina, in working directly with teachers, what are some lessons you've learned along the way as you've worked with teachers? Go ahead, Subu.
I can do that. I think one of the lessons that we've learned is not to be prescriptive. We've seen that a framework is essential, and we've also worked with the framework to make sure that there is some level of structure to the whole effort. But we've also seen downfalls in being too prescriptive about whether it is social emotional learning or whether it's about empathy. So the approach of essentially saying that if you can then look at your own social emotional learning, you can look at your own empathy, you can acknowledge your own emotions and find a structure to do that for yourself, then you can then still take that framework, and then the teachers then find a way to localize it, to adapt it, because there are several cultural nuances of how empathy plays out, and probably in India more so than a lot of countries where, between every state there are cultural sort of differences. So giving that space, giving that openness for teachers to experiment with it is something that I think has really, really worked. Being prescriptive has not worked. So that's one fundamental sort of thing that I'd like to share.
Christina, any thoughts?
Yeah, I also think that I tend to agree with Isabel that it's good that there is space and time and there are some structures and maybe some helpful tools, because teachers also often, they do agree that these things are important and they would like to teach them and they would like to devote time, but then they are also a little bit unsure and asking how, and could you give us some curriculum? Could you give us some ideas of activities? Of course, there needs to be also room for your own, ideas and how you want to make it, but it is for sure helpful, because not all teachers rely on their own, ideas, and they are very busy. They have many things to do and to learn, and at least in Finland, what I hear all the time is that the teachers are so stressed out and feel that they need to be taking care of all sorts of things and so on. So for sure, it's good to have some concrete tools also for these purposes, as they have math.
So this idea of not being too prescriptive, but also giving support where it's wanted if people need that. Rory, go ahead.
Just to kind of build on some of these points, the one thing we have to remember is that we all vary in how empathetic we are and in situations as well. So we can't just assume that all teachers are going to be able to do this in a natural way. So having some support for labeling and recognizing things is valuable, because there's a tendency in how we use the word empathy in everyday life to kind of see it as a binary, empathetic, not empathetic. But actually, there's a kind of continuum, and there's also a kind of context element too. So, when we've looked at teachers' own empathy, we've done studies where we've tried to measure teachers' variability in this. They vary just like everyone else, right? So we have to acknowledge that too.
That's an excellent point. And actually, that thinking about another question that we've had is, what role, in thinking about teaching empathy, and you said something about a spectrum, and we see a spectrum also with children. What role does assessment and data play in trying to integrate and teach empathy at kind of a system level? Is it important to measure children's empathy? And if so, why?
Well, I might just start just in that I've been thinking about how we measure empathy for a very long time, and one of the things is, firstly, it is something we think we can capture, right? As scientists, we think we can capture differences, even though it seems like a very ineffable and straight, intangible concept. What we find though traditionally is that we see that empathy does vary on a spectrum. So most measures of empathy that we have show a great deal of variability within any age that we look at in childhood. One value to measuring that is recognizing that the differences exist. So, there was a kind of school of thought at one point that empathy was something you either had or you didn't have, right? So it's this kind of threshold, but actually that's not really what we see. And so recognizing the variation is important, recognizing that each child differs. But then also as potentially as a tool for tracking change. So the way Isabel has mentioned, like using it in a data-driven way to maybe identify where we might need to put support in, identifying those children and young people who maybe need additional help. Because it isn't just a soft skill that you can naturally, master. You might need some support and guidance along the way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Isabel, I don't know if you have anything to add from the perspective of Bogota, that Bogota has participated in SSES since 2019, so in all our rounds. What's been your experience with assessing empathy and using data, and have you found it useful?
Well, yeah, it's important to measure. You probably know this by now. We believe in measurements a lot, and we believe in using information to take upon decisions. And that has to do with the fact that when you have to deal with the whole educational system, not just the school, you have to put in place policies that actually change things in schools. And to do that, you really need to measure what's going on. That doesn't mean that if the measuring doesn't go well and if it's not capturing everything that you want, then you'll get frustrated, or what happens to educational systems in general is that they fear a lot measurements because they feel that they're going to be judged about the results. And I believe a lot in formative measurement, so that you actually implement policies and that you can change them in a way, and you don't wait until the end to see if they're successful. And a whole school, life schooling for kids went on, and you couldn't fix anything on the way. And empathy specifically, I will say, is a developable skill. You have said that in many ways. It's not a fixed trait. So I think that allows to give us information to see how we're doing it. And basically, what we do in Bogota with empathy, we actually measure in 3 dimensions: cognitive empathy, affective empathy, and empathetic concern. And you can have one, for example, the cognitive understanding of what empathy is, but you don't have the actual pro-social action about it. So you need to understand what's going on in children's head and what's going to happen with these skills to be able to do the following work you need to do to get them where you need them. So yeah, so basically we love measurements, but we love measurements to be able to change things, to improve the quality of education, and to improve the well-being of kids, not just to measure our policies.
Yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying. As even also me as a formative teacher as a former teacher of using assessments in a formative way as sort of feedback to identify what kids who need extra help. How are we doing? Otherwise you're flying blind. You don't know where you're going. And I definitely see the chat people saying same things, like Marcos asking about what tools are out there. Where do we start when we're looking for this? So I'll let you guys reply to those. And actually, speaking of the chat, we have a lot of good questions coming up that tie into some of the things we're already discussing. So, for example, Malak from Denmark has asked, how does the OECD, or I think systems and governments in general, avoid shifting responsibility from systems to students when measuring empathy? And Malak, I hope I'm interpreting you correctly here. The idea that I think if we're measuring empathy at the student level, do we end up saying it's your responsibility, kid, to be better at empathy and do better, rather than focusing more on like the system? What are schools, adults, everybody collectively doing? How do we avoid that danger of shifting that responsibility too much onto individual kids? Anyone want to jump in? Go ahead, Rory.
I might just jump in on a kind of an alternative take on that in some ways. So some elements of empathy are, there are children and young people who particularly struggle with these skills. So we have different profiles of empathy. So there are many studies comparing youth with various different neurodevelopmental conditions or mental health conditions, showing different profiles of empathy. So they may have very good cognitive empathy, the ability to understand other people's thoughts and feelings, but less responsive at an emotional level to those, for example. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to understand individual children's profiles in that respect, because sometimes some children do need additional support and help to navigate the classroom and the social world around them.
Anyone else? Thank you so much for that thought, that, like, maybe not to think so much in terms of absolutes here, but to recognize that there are values for different things. Any other thoughts from our panelists? Go ahead, Isabel.
Yeah, the idea of measuring and assessment in general is really not to label students. And I agree with Rory that you have to raise a flag when you find that a student is not accomplishing what they need to accomplish in a certain moment. But it's not to label them, it's to be able to correct the policies that you're implementing. And so the assessment is very tricky in that sense, because we either judge the kids a lot because we had put a lot of weight into assessment in general to be able to reach different stages of education or to reach better schools in general, or the general assessments that actually judge policies, and what they do is have a political impact more than actually changing social policies or implementing different policies in schools. So I think assessment has to be taken as it is we need to accomplish and to give kids the acknowledgement and the skills they need to thrive in this world. And that's the responsibility of the education sector in general. So assessment is part of this process.
Mm-hmm. I'm liking this, as someone with a bit of a research background, this idea of not thinking in absolutes and seeing the value of different things and depending on the situation makes a lot of sense to me, but it's hard to do. I want to shift it again to some questions we've gotten from our attendees. A lot of people have been asking, this sounds great, how do we do this? So, for example, Gifty Chan from Hong Kong has asked, how can we systematically teach empathy? And Marivik from the Philippines has asked, is it enough to have SEL and teaching empathy in one subject, or does it need to involve the whole school community? So how do you teach it? Where do you start? And you guys have touched on this a little bit, but I'd love to hear more. Go ahead, Suku.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think we'll ever have one answer for it, but I want to maybe reframe the question a little bit. Instead of saying how do we teach empathy, how about reframing it and saying how do we design conditions in which empathy develops and thrives? I would like to reframe it that way. And when we look at it that way, there are then multiple levers that actually emerge, right? One is obviously skill building. So, for example, the ability to acknowledge and name emotions, for example, the ability to take perspectives, the ability to listen deeply, more than just surface listening, for example. So there's skill building that is involved, but there's also practice opportunities that are required. So you have to create spaces for peer interactions to happen. You have to create spaces for conflicts in schools to emerge and then be dealt and then be sort of handled and managed, for example, right? Including student voices in the whole conversation around all of this. And of course, adult modeling, and how do you create structures for teachers to be able to model out all of this behavior? So if you reframe it that way, then essentially then also it comes back to the previous question, you're not then essentially making it either the responsibility of a student to learn empathy, or the responsibility of a teacher to teach empathy, or the responsibility of a system to just put a policy around it. You're then creating responsibilities at multiple levels. And that's when you design those conditions. So we can't afford to do one or the other. We'll have to find ways to do all of them, right? And I think that's how I would sort of reframe the question and my response there.
So creating spaces where empathy can grow and thrive. Great way to put it. Christina, go ahead.
Yes, maybe from my perspective, which is bullying prevention, what we are trying to do, for instance, in the Kiva program, we are trying to make the bystanders who witness bullying to behave differently, not to go along with the bullying, not to reinforce the bully's behaviors, but rather to support and defend those peers who are victimized. We know that this is strongly associated with empathy, by the way. So those kids who report more empathy, they tend to defend and support their peers who are victimized. But what we also know is that empathy is not enough. So teaching empathy, enhancing empathy, if we now talk about affective and cognitive empathy, like Rory was mentioning in the beginning, it's not enough alone. I mean, in order to help to behave pro-socially and, for instance, help someone who is in need, defend someone who is victimized, you also need to know how to have some kind of strategies, what could be safe ways for me to do that, and have some feeling of self-efficacy. I know how to do that, and maybe together with others, it's even easier. So maybe my point here is just that, yes, empathy is very important, but alone, it's not enough always to take action. In the early definitions of empathy, at least, there was no action involved. It was about, getting the others' thoughts and feelings and then feeling the same. And maybe now, as Rory mentioned in the beginning, there might be a third dimension in some definitions, which is this action part. But there are also some people who have suggested replacing the concept of empathy with compassion or some other concepts where this action dimension is even more important. So we need to teach our children also strategies and ways how they can concretely, what they can do concretely, for instance, to include someone when they notice that someone is being left out or alone, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Again, sort of giving those guides and seeing how empathy interacts with the whole system, like the school community, motivation, strategies for action, spaces, fascinating and complex stuff. And before we wrap up, we have a couple more questions. One thing that's come up a lot in our chat and also in some of the questions submitted before was this idea of interculturality and this idea of what's universal, what's specific. So, for example, from Dominic Register in Austria and Samuel Oladipo in the US, they have both asked about, well, how do you balance sharing practice internationally while also considering culture and context? Healthy empathy can look different in different societies. So in your experience, what is universal and therefore worth sharing through, for example, panels like these, and what needs to be culturally adapted? Rory.
I think this is a really fascinating question, and it links back to something that Christina was saying. So traditionally, as researchers, we've thought about this idea of of the cognitive empathy, the understanding others, the affective empathy, the feeling with others. And if I had to put money on it, I'd be fairly confident that those skills exist across the species as a whole. They are things that can be measured and have been measured and studied across cultures. The element that is probably more contextual or culturally bound is the action bit in some ways, right? Because the kind of guidelines for how to respond in certain situations are going to vary by culture. So what is pro-social or helpful in one setting may not be in another. So I think there's probably a sense that some of the core elements of empathy, the ability to just understand someone else or to feel in response, are quite universal, but the kind of manifestations, how you act on it, are probably going to be the part that's much more context specific, I would say.
Thank you. Subu, go ahead.
I think what is universal is this capacity that we have as human beings for empathy. That's universal. We all have that capacity. But how we express it is what is cultural in that sense, right? So, for example, what we feel in different situations is very universal. I don't think anybody feels sort of happy when there's a war or a conflict going on, but the way that it is expressed, the language of that emotion tends to be very cultural and very contextual. The idea of respect, the idea of dignity is very universal. But how that then translates into, say, a school climate, how does it translate into a set of classroom norms is contextual. That's how, and the action part, Rory, that you talked about, right? And I think that's very, very contextual as well. For example, in India, well, maybe just me, but I can't speak for the rest of the country. But emotional expression is not necessarily my strong suit. But in India, care and responsibility. So basically, an elder sibling taking care of the younger one is a symbol of empathy. We don't have to express ourselves, but that care and responsibility, right? So those aspects then tend to be very cultural and contextual. Yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead, Isabel.
Just to add, not getting into the cultural worldwide differences, but what happens in the classroom, I think the more diversity that you have within a classroom, the easiest it is to teach empathy and social emotional skills in general. If you know how to address that, when you have differences, is where you can teach that the most. And I think once you actually give the tools to teachers to be able to do that, if they have differences in the classroom, they're going to be very successful.
This, I think, is really, really encouraging, this idea of that the capacity for empathy is universal. Diversity can really be a good thing because it gives us so many opportunities to enhance these skills. I think we have time for maybe one more question before we do our wrap up. And it's come up from a couple of people, for example, Luana, who's asked about, what do you think is the role of school principals in fostering empathy? And I think this, I can't remember, it was Christina, came up early in the chat. I was thinking about, the role of school leaders. Because if we think, okay, this needs to be a whole school effort, we need to create spaces and an environment where this can thrive. Well, what role can school leaders play?
Okay, I will start again. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Because we're silent. We're doing that. We're actually teaching as a part of the program the leadership, the coordinators, the principals, because you really need to have an institutional alignment to be able to transform this. And social emotional skills start from the leadership of the school. So it's very interesting because we had a lot of questions around the program that we started implementing, and we started teaching and doing these social emotional workshops with leadership, with the directors, the coordinator, and the psychologist. We are not including teachers in this part, and it has to do with the fact that you have to have the institutional framework to be able to promote social skills in general. So I think it's essential to have that.
Other thoughts about the role of school leaders? I don't know if Subbu or Christina in your work again with schools. Go ahead, Christina.
Yes, I think school leaders are really important because they, of course, set the ground for teachers, and how they feel at school and in their work. And someone was earlier talking about the feeling of safety of the teachers and how they are treated, whether they feel respected and whether they feel that they are listened to and so on. But then another thing, of course, is that it's also school leaders who define what is prioritized in the school, what things are considered important and valued, and what things are provided resources and time and space that are needed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And that actually, I think, is a perfect segue to our wrap up. There are unfortunately lots of questions that we can't get today, questions about the role of technology and how that might affect empathy, available tools and methods. So we will follow up with resources and follow-up emails with the recording of this webinar for all of our attendees and everyone who registered but couldn't make it. So hopefully you will have some answers to your questions and things to follow up on. As a last question, I would love to hear from each one of our panelists here. If you could only choose one next step or action, what is, in your view, the best thing that we can do next to promote empathy in our schools and education systems. Rory, go ahead.
It's kind of looping back just to something you mentioned a moment ago about classroom diversity. So we recently published a study where we found that children with cross-ethnic friendships, so friends who are not from your same race or background, perform way better on tests of empathy. And we also find that diverse classrooms, the children in those classrooms have on average higher levels of empathy on our tests and measures. And so one thing I would probably say is maybe mix it up a bit, right? So avoid streaming where possible. You know, some schools cluster children who are very similar to each other in terms of ability and background in different tables or different classrooms. And it seems to us that the kind of diversity is the key, in that you are being exposed to difference, which means you are actively having to empathize when you interact with your peers. So that could be a very basic thing, I think.
Sounds like a wonderful thing, especially in an age where I think even at a school and system level, we're seeing segregation as people collect in communities of like-minded people. So that's really encouraging to see something you sense might be the case to actually materialize. Subu and then Christina.
Yeah, I think I'll go back to the point I made earlier about designing conditions in which empathy develops and thrives. If we want to do that, then I think the action would really then be to almost take empathy and make it a design principle in education systems, right? Where you're not treating it as always as a standalone sort of construct and then doing that, but actually treating it as one of those foundational threads. So embedding that in teacher support, embedding that in curriculum, embedding that in school climate, and embedding that in assessment as well. So what if we could do that? What if we could actually make empathy as a design principle for education? So that would be my sort of little action towards that.
Thank you. Christina and then Isabel.
What comes to my mind, and it was partly inspired by what Rory just said about diversity, and I was thinking that, yeah, everyone is not exposed to diversity, but maybe what is important for all of us is to be exposed to different experiences and different worlds of people. And by that, I mean that just sharing our emotions, sharing our feelings, that is what creates connections between people. And one important way also of being exposed to different people and their experiences and their worlds is stories. And unfortunately, as we know, young people don't read so much as they used to read, but I would say that, yeah, maybe 2S, sharing overall with each other, but then importantly, stories where we can be exposed to even wider variety of people and their experiences and feelings.
Thank you for that. Isabel, last one.
Okay, first of all, I just want to thank you, all of you, because I've learned a lot, and it's very important, I think, to hear this every day. When you're managing a school system completely, you actually forget about empathy too, which is great. So thank you so much. Well, it was very clear for me that empathy cannot be imposed. It's something that you really have to experience, model, practice every day, and it has to be done by everyone in the community, adults, children, through, of course, a purpose set up, not just something that should happen because we're all good people and we're empathetic, but because we need to know how to address the different challenges we have. There are schools in Bogota that have such challenges in terms of social well-being of kids that teachers, get completely frightened. So they really don't know what to do in the classroom, even though they're prepared. So having a whole community that actually practice and shows and models empathy in general is going to be very helpful to be able to overcome all these situations. So thanks again.
Thank you so much for that. And with that lovely note about community and coming together, I think we'll wrap up today's webinar. Thank you so much to our panelists, to everyone at the OECD comms team who helped with this, to everyone who's joined today. Please look out for a follow-up email that will contain a list of all the resources that have been mentioned today, as well as a link to the recording. Please share it amongst yourselves. We saw a lot of lovely comments about all the awesome resources and materials that are being shared. So hopefully our respective communities can expand. So thank you very much, everybody, and especially very deep thanks to our 4 panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.